Welcome to the New Intellectuals. I'm delighted to be here with Christina Heatherton, an American Studies scholar, the co-editor with myself of Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, which is out from Verso, and the author of the forthcoming book, Making Internationalism, The Color Line, the Class Struggle, and the Mexican Revolution, which will be published by the University of California Press. So thanks so much for taking the time to be with me today, Christina.
Thanks for having me.
You just gave a talk here at TPF about Elizabeth Catlett, so I wanted to start there. Who's Elizabeth Catlett, and why did you choose to write about her?
Yeah, sure. Well, Elizabeth Catlett, according to her biographer, Melanie Ann Herzog, was possibly one of the most important American artists of the 20th century, and I happen to agree with that. She was a printer, a painter, mostly known for her sculptures. But she's somebody that I think a lot of people have encountered, particularly through her famous sharecropper image, a lot of the images she did during the Black Power movement. There's a very striking sculpture she did called Target. It's a man's head with a kind of rifle scope in front of it that she did in commemoration of the Chicago Police Department's assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. So, she's an artist that I think a lot of people are familiar with, but whose story I don't think a lot of people know. So, that's partially what I wanted to try to do, is tell her story.
So part of the story that you told on Saturday night here at the People's Forum was about the legacy and her vision of radical internationalism, which you suggested has been neglected, if not obscured, in previous work. Could you tell us a little bit about that vision?
Sure. Well, part of the question is my own, and part of the question is something that a lot of scholars have started writing about. So Rebecca Schreiber wrote a really excellent book called Cold War Exiles in Mexico. And she talks a little bit about Catlett, but the conclusion is about Catlett and about, this kind of hidden history of radicalism that was never talked about. Mary Helen Washington wrote this extraordinary book called The Other Blacklist. And at the conclusion of that book, similarly, is, she says, why haven't we reckoned with Elizabeth Catlett's revolutionary history? So there's a lot of great studies that think about the history of radical feminist women on the Black left, including Dale Gore, Cheryl Higashida. There's a number of others. And, for some reason, Elizabeth Catlett's name is just kind of peppered through. She's not been given the serious engagement as someone who is a part of that scene, a part of that work. She's usually designated as a fellow traveler or someone who is just an illustrator. But when you actually look at the archive, you go through her many oral histories, you look at the correspondence that she's had with some of the fiercest anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist organizers of the period, you find out that she was an extraordinary person, and this is what motivated her art.
And so one of the things that really resonated for me, at least, was this discussion of Catlett's participation in these collectives. Chicago, Harlem, Mexico City. Could you tell us a little bit of that story?
Sure. Well, the way I structured the talk was to talk about how Catlett was a product of and also helped produce these revolutionary spaces, what I call convergent spaces, and I can talk a little bit more about that later. So the three spaces that I look at are the Southside Community Art Center in Chicago, the George Washington Carver School in Harlem, and an art collective in Mexico City called the Taller de Gráfica Popular, or the TGP. And in each of these spaces, I think you get a really fascinating sense of the revolutionary currents, the kind of convergence of different revolutionary traditions, the kind of conversations that were happening. So right now, I think there's a question among scholars and among organizers, how do these things go together? How can somebody be anti-capitalist and anti-racist and anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist, And I think we're really taught to think about these things as discrete and separate and sometimes antagonistic. And so recovering Catlett's history through each of these spaces and being able to say that she was a product of these conversations, that she, helped further these conversations, I think helps us get a better sense of who she was as a person, but also what these conversations were a century ago, or almost a century ago.
So one of the things that Catlett's perhaps most noted for is doing a lot of her work in Mexico with the TGP, which she goes there in the late 1940s, right? And could you tell us about some of the work that she was doing as a part of the collective? You mentioned The Black Woman, I think, as one of the series that she worked on.
Yeah, and maybe I'll answer that question by saying, a lot of this research happened in order to solve a mystery. So, I'm writing a book that's thinking about internationalist, kind of traditions of internationalism that are related to the Mexican Revolution. So, I don't know how long ago, it felt like a very long time ago, I went to the archives in Stanford to look at this series that the Taller had produced about the Mexican Revolution. It was supposed to be this popular history in 85 different line-of-cut prints, just telling people without words, like this is what the history was. So I'm looking through all these prints, really beautiful. And in the same box, there is this collection called The Black Woman, made by Elizabeth Catlett. Elizabeth Catlett had contributed some of the prints to the Mexican Revolutionary series, but here was this whole folder full of prints, with images of Harriet Tubman and Phyllis Wheatley, depictions of Black women leading struggles of unemployed workers, fighting segregation in housing and public transportation. This is in 1946. Right? There's a picture of a Black woman in a segregated bus that I think when most people see it, they assume it's Rosa Parks. But this was produced long before. And there's this really extraordinary presence of Black domestic workers as being the center of history. So I was sitting in this archive looking at these two series, thinking I was going to, trying to tell one type of story, and then realizing there was a totally different story to be told. And when I started looking at the two prints together, I realized there was all this stylistic and political resonance between the two. The way that Pancho Villa or Emiliano Zapata is figured in, the Mexican Revolutionary series. Well, she has Phyllis Wheatley and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth in a very similar pose, and I mean, look, I could talk about this for a long time, but long story short, is I had to try to solve that mystery. How did that conversation come about? How did that conversation among artists, among political artists come about? And as I looked into it a little further, I started to recognize that these artists in Mexico were doing these extraordinary pictures of Paul Robeson, of Ben Davis, who was a communist councilman in Harlem, of Du Bois, of Phyllis Wheatley themselves. So I both had to, try to understand how had this internationalist collective of Mexican artists influenced this Black artist, but how in turn did she influence and further their politics? So, this chapter is just an attempt to try to solve that mystery.
Her work is a part of a conversation, and this focus on the domestic worker was likewise a part of this conversation that was taking place in this period. Esther Cooper Jackson wrote an MA thesis, Claudia Jones is writing famously. How do you see the work of Elizabeth Catlett as part of that conversation?
Right. Yeah. Alice Childress is, writing a regular column thinking about the life of Black domestic workers. Ella Baker and Marvell Cook famously wrote the Bronx slave market, and they're thinking about the plight of domestic workers. There's, a presence of women that are organized. I mean, New York City is a place where domestic workers are the most organized in the whole country. So the fact that Elizabeth Catlett is, thinking about Black domestic workers in this period, I think demands explanation at the same time as these other, fierce Black feminists are writing and theorizing about the role of Black domestic workers. So, part of the argument that I make is that you have to understand how Catlett came into contact with Black domestic workers. And I think something very particular happened while she was in Harlem. So Catlett was a part of something called the George Washington Carver School. This was a labor school. It had a relationship to the Communist Party between 1923 and about 1957, the largest network of adult education in the country. Were these labor schools and Marxist schools that were largely organized by the Communist Party. This is something that, really falls out of our consciousness and history. And so the George Washington Carver School was the school in Harlem. And while people have talked about some of the other schools, Marvin Gettleman, Denise Lynn have written really great studies of, for example, the Jefferson School, nobody has thought about the history of this school in Harlem, which was mostly volunteer run. You had people coming from Juilliard teaching classes. You had people coming from Brooklyn College, from, all over. Du Bois, Harold Cruz teaches he gets his first lecture from Du Bois at the Carver School. So what was fascinating for me is that the most popular class at the George Washington Carver School was one that Elizabeth Catlett taught called How to Make a Dress. And in this class, she's teaching a lot of Black domestic workers. And in the process of showing them how to make a dress, they're having these extraordinary conversations about space, about labor, about gender, about the various vulnerabilities and intersections that are happening in Harlem. And so that's where the title of the talk and the chapter come from. And that's, I think, what really provides the terrain of engagement for Catlett to be thinking about Black domestic workers while she's thinking about internationalism.
So as you said before, this book is organized around spaces, what you term convergent spaces. These range from these art collectives to unemployed councils to federal penitentiaries and beyond. And so what are convergent spaces and how do they help us understand the theories of internationalism that animated the struggles of this period?
Sure. I define convergent spaces as socio-spatial sites where different revolutionary traditions were compressed in space. And that might be a mouthful, but really what I'm trying to do is to be able to say, look, there are all these conversations happening necessarily, right? Because of the contradictions of capitalism. It forces people together. Anybody who's organized in struggle understands that, a huge part of organizing is just trying to figure out where are people coming from, what are their points of reference, and in the process of those conversations, new syntheses happen. And we really need a kind of dynamic, history of how that happens. So it's a hard thing to kind of talk about conversations that are happening all over the world at the same time. So the idea of a convergent space is a kind of device to be able to temporarily freeze still and just isolate that. So for example, I have a chapter in the book called How to Make a University. And this is about Leavenworth Penitentiary during the First World War. And what I'm interested in is during the First World War, there were the Espionage and Sedition Act. And so it made it a federal crime to, long story short, if you were organizing as a communist, as a pacifist, as a socialist, as an anarchist, as a nationalist, all of a sudden, you could be arrested and sent to a federal penitentiary. So I look at Leavenworth Penitentiary and, there are all these Mexican revolutionaries there. There are all these Indian nationalists that are fighting against British colonialism. There are all these Wobblies. There are all these communists. And they're all there at the same time. They're all talking together. They're writing a newspaper together. And as federal surveillance files said, they were making a university. University of Radicalism comes from this federal surveillance file. So, that's an example of how the convergent space comes together, right? It's kind of too difficult and it can feel sort of assertive just to say, these conversations were happening at the same time. But if you can show how they were compressed in space and people, through struggle were forced to, have conversations, synthesize these discussions, then I think you get this really rich record for the kind of political theorizing that was happening, from working class movements throughout the 20th century.
So one of the things you're really interested in terms of that political theory that was being developed by the movements of the period is a synthesis between questions of the color line and of the class struggle. Mm-hmm. What's the argument that you make?
Working on this project over the past decade, and, after working with you on Policing the Planet, right, and being very involved in struggles for housing, struggles against police violence, anti-war struggles, right? I think whatever my intention when I came up with the project, it's evolved so that I understand now that what's important about staging these conversations is to show people that there's a long tradition of this happening. We don't have to reinvent the wheel right now. Before this interview started, I promised myself, I was like, don't talk about Tim Wise, don't talk about Tim Wise, but let me just talk about Tim Wise for a second. So, people like Tim Wise who say that, anti-racists can also be socialists are idiots, but I feel like this is a kind of prime example of the kind of, intellectual barriers we run up against in terms of what we have the capacity to imagine And so just being able to say that people were thinking about these questions together in really vibrant ways, throughout the 20th century, I think it gives us this much deeper, richer, stronger legacy that we can fight with today.
So I want to ask you about today. I mean, we live in a decisive historical moment, one marked by an existential crisis of capitalism, a crisis of imperialism, a resurgence of neo-fascism, a kind of aggressive, racist and patriarchal nationalisms. Why is the study of the internationalist traditions that you're tracing so important now?
Well, a different way to ask that question is, a very bitter way that I got asked kind of recently, which is, why is this internationalism? Why isn't it just about solidarity? And I think, there's something particular about the crisis right now that demands that we think about internationalism rather than just solidarity. And namely, it's because a lot of the ways that the crisis of capitalism is expressing itself is as nationalist struggles, right? I mean, you could look just today, on this day, March 2nd, 2020, right? If you went to Modi's India and you thought about the violent nationalist, like mob violence that's getting stoked by the government, or you looked in Brazil, right? And you think about how Bolsonaro is also mobilizing the most racist, the most sexist and homophobic kind of discourse to incite a similar kind of nationalist violence. Or we could go on and on, parts of Ukraine, but particularly in the United States right now. I think some of the most frightening elements are, just sexist, homophobic, racist, white nationalists who are amassing. And so, just the kind of question of an abstract solidarity, which can mean anything, I think is really insufficient to confront what we're facing right now. And so revivifying the question of internationalism and really interrogating that definition. I feel like this has been a term that's we've been discouraged from thinking about this tradition. But to confront the crisis that we are facing right now demands that we re-engage with this language and this tradition and really think about all the rich ways that people have taken it up. And I'll just say one last thing, because I think what's given me a lot of confidence to write this book is that a lot of the ways that the tradition of internationalism gets dismissed is that, especially in very, elite spaces, you're taught that, internationalist tradition, Marxist traditions are Eurocentric. They are sexist. They are racist, right? They don't have anything to say about colonialism. And this is ridiculous. Anybody who actually knows the history of these traditions knows that that's patently false, right? And knows that most of the people in the world who have taken up these traditions have not done so in European context. But to be able to stage all these conversations and show how it's been working class people who are coming from these different struggles, who have been, trying to synthesize these conversations. This is what I mean by saying, there's a rich legacy that we've been denied that I think we ought to recover for the present.
And so I just want to ask you about the present, maybe come full circle to where we started, with your talk about Elizabeth Catlett. I mean, one of the things you invited us to consider was her vision of radical pedagogy and why that was important, the importance of popular education. I wonder if you might reflect on the importance of popular education in our own time.
Sure. There's a lot of different ways I can answer that question, so I'm just choosing in my brain right now. But at this very moment, the students at UC Santa Cruz, the graduate students, are on strike, and students at UC San Diego, at UC Santa Barbara, at UCLA are all thinking about going on sympathy strikes with them. And what is this strike for? It's them saying the work that they're providing the universities is labor, and that they should be compensated for it. And all they're asking for is a slight adjustment, make their stipends commensurate with the cost of living in each of those areas, right? Santa Cruz is in Silicon Valley. It's got some of the highest property values in the whole country. And so we're seeing right now this tension between, in the terrain of education. And you look at the state of California, right? 6th largest economy in the world if it was its own country, right? And who's the largest employer? The University of California, right? Look at the driver of every city or municipality. It's meds and eds, it's universities and their, related medical facilities. This is what's driving the economy at this moment largely. And so the clampdown on these students, convincing them that doing this kind of intellectual work isn't labor, this is just an iteration of, I think, a broader crisis of education right now. It's almost 80% of all jobs in higher education are now contingent, right? People are barely getting paid a minimum wage, if not a living wage, to do this work. I was a contingent laborer in New York teaching at Baruch College 15 years ago, right? Making absolutely nothing, but having the benefit of getting teaching experience. So there are all these different ways that we can see higher education under assault, education budgets getting just slashed across the country, right? And so, there's a lot of different ways to think about the importance of political education. But I would say primarily, if you think about the transformations in the political economy of education, how it's being degraded. If we are not creating alternative education structures, ways that we can teach each other, to be ready to fight in this moment, we certainly can't rely on, what's available to do that work for us. So, revisiting this history, thinking about what people have done, what people at the People's Forum have done, to create an educational infrastructure that's responsive to the world, that's thinking about how, as General Baker said, turning fighters into thinkers and thinkers into fighters. This is what we need to survive this moment.
Thanks for joining the New Intellectuals.
Thank you.
Stay tuned for upcoming episodes with Mary Louise Patterson and others. We thank you for joining the New Intellectuals.